Hello and welcome everybody for another installment of the AI Files. We're going to be having a special guest with us today that will go through AI strategy and really talking about hype to reality. So with that, let's sit back, do a quick intro of the AI Files, and we'll get back with our special guest that will be with us today. Hold on tight, folks.
Greetings. Welcome to the AI Files podcast. You're looking to stay up to date on the AI. This is the podcast for you. I'm Shadab Hussain. I'm the director of AI at Microsoft, and I'm your co-host.
Hello, everybody. Jamie Basilico, as you know already. I'm the other co-host here for the AI Files. My day job is a data and AI technical specialist and architect. And as a reminder, please note this is not an official Microsoft channel, so the views and opinions expressed by myself and Shadab are our own and do not represent the views of Microsoft. And now I want to welcome our special guest. That will be Michelle Wallig. I'm going to bring Michelle on stage now. Hey, Michelle.
Hi, everybody. Hey, Jamie. How you doing?
Doing good, doing good. Hopefully it's not too hot where you are. I know the last couple of days here on the East Coast, it's been like a steam bath with tons of rain.
We're in Florida, so it's always 90.
Yeah, always 90 and always raining down there.
Yep, that's right.
So just to remind everybody, Michelle, do you want to do a quick intro of yourself?
Sure. Sure. Jamie and I go back a ways. I was with Microsoft for 24 years. We had very similar careers there and ending up as CTOs at Microsoft in professional services. And so the AI strategy discussion that I'm going to share with you today is really comes out of a lot of that experience and experience afterwards that I've done on my own as a sole proprietor, and just to share like the real truth behind getting you to an AI environment.
Great. Yeah, I know this is definitely top of mind for a lot of folks. I mean, it's one thing to dabble into AI and try to look at like how quote unquote ChatGPT or Gemini or some of the other models how they work, but it's another thing to actually implement that within an organization. There's everything from change management to how you'll lay the groundwork for what data would be used, and to everything from how do you actually implement it. And there's a lot of different moving parts into that, if you will. I guess maybe an opening question for you will be,
Sure.
What do you believe is the biggest the biggest lift or a specific business process that any organization will need to look after, undertake as they look at building an AI strategy or at least an AI roadmap?
Sure. I think most companies want to focus on, making their customers happy while delivering new products. So customer insight into delivering new product development is like a critical theme, if you will, for AI, most AI strategy where an actual investment will come to be. There's a lot of other things you hear about, like workflow automation and other opportunities, like you said, using like ChatGPT or Copilot at an individual level. But really, the money is going to be in revenue growth. A CEO, a CFO, CTO, they're going to be focused on how to grow that business. And so customer insight now has become very interesting in terms of how to capture social media input, not just customer surveys, not just the patterns of buying patterns that customers have with your company, but what are they saying about it? Whose other products are they buying? What are those competitors selling? That customer insight has become critical to developing new products that are going to satisfy, the marketplace.
So what I'm gathering then, it really doesn't matter what industry that kind of cuts
Doesn't
across
matter.
any industry, and it's really that business process that could potentially see the biggest impact, revenue, whatever you want to classify as that. Okay.
Exactly. Because you're not going to have an investment without an impact financially.
Yeah, I mean,
That's true.
my personal experiences, you might get some what I'll call tire kickers that will look at AI, but until you actually get business buy-in, who typically will have the purse strings anyway. um, they're going to look for return on that investment, and whether or not that means, new growth or just expanding, the existing business
Yeah.
processes or existing business, they're not going to invest in it. So yeah, that's something that they're going to want to see. It makes sense.
Yeah, there's a lot of information from social media, as you know, that's going to potentially differentiate their product from their competitors. That's their goal. And
Hmm.
so with that, it's going to give that lift that you're asking about, to the business overall. Because if they're going to invest $1 million and it's not going to generate $1 million in, return on investment, why do it? So,
Right.
that's the thing when I talk about hype to reality. I hear, I watch the CNBC stock analysts and talking to CEOs. It's like, AI is easy. Well, it's still, you still have to go through a process.
Yeah.
It can be easy to play with ChatGPT or Copilot, sure. But if
Right.
you're looking at an enterprise, level application, that's just like you do with other enterprise applications, right? You still need that fortitude. You still need that process. You still need that diligence.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's very easy to pick up a tool. Granted, you still need to
Yeah.
train how to use it, but there's so much underneath. If you think about an iceberg, you only see the tip of it. There's so much that's below that waterline, and
Hmm.
things that you need to, think about and implement, which I'm sure we'll get into, and I know we will.
Yeah.
Um, let me like kind of maybe change something on its head that most people talk about when they, you know, discuss AI, and it's always about, oh, what's the risk if we implement AI? It's, and don't get me wrong, I'm not diminishing the need for this, but there's obviously risk around exposing too much data. Do you have the right security? But I also think there's a risk if you don't do it. So I guess my question to you is, as you're, working with organizations and building
Hmm.
out an AI strategy,
Hmm.
what would be the single most damaging consequence for a company that doesn't adopt AI?
Yeah, I think with my AI strategies, there's three things that are necessary. Microsoft years ago was like the pioneer in this, and that's responsible AI, right? How do you make sure it's secure, private, no bias, misinformation, is hallucinations are controlled? That's the biggest risk, in my opinion. In addition, you still need data governance, like you always have. You still need AI governance now, which are completely, different in a lot of ways in this new environment. So the risk of not doing it is having someone else be the differentiator. Sorry, um, you know, creating that differentiated product that's gonna, reduce your impact to the market. That's, I think, the risk by not doing it. There are so many benefits to doing it that I think it's, really necessary for people to make that investment and define their strategy so that one of my clients did two kind of parallel work streams. One was AI for the enterprise, which is where you're really getting into big, LLMs and RAG models, et cetera, applications, agents, all that. And then AI for everyone, which is the tools like Copilot, ChatGPT that people can use in their own workflow. So you reduce the risk of implementing either of those, I think, if you have the right responsible AI framework, the data governance and AI governance, in order to make sure everyone's treating the data correctly and that the AI experience enhances the experience for everybody.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's critical points. I mean, you mentioned some things like obviously you want to stay ahead of the competitive curve,
Yeah, for
for
sure.
what peers might be doing as it relates to AI, but also importance. It's is the data, as you mentioned. To
Yeah,
me, I know you and I are both
number one.
from the data ilk, and
Yeah.
that's critical. And a consequence might be, if you don't have your data in the right form or structure, that will certainly put you behind the curve from what others may do as it relates to AI. So,
One of my favorite data scientists, you and I both know actually, Dr. Jerry Smith, he had a really great article today about that whole data cleanup that you need to put it into a model. And there are so many cycles and GPUs and everything used on bad data. It's clean up the data first, right? Because otherwise you're just wasting energy, you're wasting time, looking at data that's not ready and won't be ready for AI, and it's just should be removed. It was a really good article, and you don't think of things like that, but we always think about when I go in and talk to my clients, what systems are you deprecating in the next year, so I don't bring it into the architecture. It's the same thing. What data should be deprecated?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And
It's a new type of thinking.
right. It's not only the notion of data retention or data archiving, but what could we trim from the ever growing
Exactly.
data landscape.
Exactly.
You mentioned that article by Dr. Jerry Smith. Okay, definitely, we'll include that in the show notes so people could look at it because I'm curious
Yeah.
of looking at it as well.
Mhm.
So I know that we've certainly chatted about the strategy, and before I get into the next question, can you talk a little bit about like this 3-year strategic AI plan? Like, what is it? What does it entail? And then I'll have a question for you as it relates to the return on investment that's within that
Sure.
3-year plan.
A 3-year plan really is preceded by a budgeting cycle, to be honest. You first have to spend, probably about 3 to 4 months just to figure out what is your AI strategy. Then you probably go into a budgeting cycle with the CFO and CEO of the company for 3 to 4 more months, right? Another full quarter. And so what they're going to want to see is that return on investment within 1, 2, 3 years. So the 3-year strategy entails identifying your top priorities. Oftentimes a handful is what you'll need. But, one of the projects I did, they had over 250 use cases. And we had to boil it down to like the 3 that they were going to initially invest in as pilots. And so that's important because you now have a library of 250 use cases that over those 3 years, you can take the priorities, that were designated during that exercise and continuously, add new features, functionality, new capabilities in the AI. And within 3 years, the technology changes so fast, you really kind of have to time bound it because there's going to be, I help figure out like there's so many LinkedIn articles that get posted that I always repost. Like, if you need help figuring out all these tools, give me a call, right? Because, they love to post like, oh, for Agentics, there's like 100 tools. Well, that's really difficult to get your arms around.
Right.
And to figure out what works with the business use cases that you just identified. So I think a 3-year plan is a good way to really get it into a habit at the corporation, that you have a rigorous process to actually load new data, add new algorithms, create new experiences, chats, whatever. And so, and the return on investment, that the CEO and CFO, they want to see within 3 years.
So that seems very akin to some of the work that we were doing a couple of years ago as it relates to
sure.
the 3-year horizon or the
That's right.
this vision, which kind of lays out 3 different horizon views, like what's now, what's a little bit in the future, and then more out in the future.
Mm-hmm. Innovation. Mm-hmm.
Yep. So part of that, and you even mentioned it, it's things around determining what the return on investment is. And I think you had mentioned what you started out with 250 or so use cases, and that got whittled down to 3. And I'm assuming that was part of the pilot.
Those are the pilots. Mm-hmm.
So I guess the question is, before you're embarking on those pilots, and this ties back to something that we were just talking about before, which is like, how do you quantify, how do you determine the biggest lift? There's obviously some group that's funding those pilots. And
That's right.
as it relates to the 3-year plan, ultimately, obviously, again, it goes back to increase revenue, increase, productivity or efficiency in the things that they do. How are you like quantifying that ROI on those 3 particular use cases before you actually get to doing the pilots? Like, what are you using some special AI formula?
No. I mean, it's it's typical ROI calculations. So, you're looking at what the investment is, what the potential revenue lift is. There's also not just revenue, but margins, right? So what is the margin that you've achieved over the last 5 years? That becomes your new target margin. And so how do you achieve that? So if you have $1 million and your margin's 35%, right, in revenue, that's a goal. And so you have to establish those up front in order to measure them in 3 years, right?
Mhm.
What was the target margin? Did we achieve it? And they're realistic margins to help grow the company. If you don't have the margins, if you don't have the, revenue, what's the point, to be honest? I mean, productivity is always on the tip of people's tongue. Oh, workflow automation for productivity and that kind of thing. But it's harder to capture. So, how I capture productivity is like, if I had to do this PowerPoint presentation by myself, how long would it take me? 3 hours, right? If I used ChatGPT and fed it all the prompts and every data that it needed, it would create it in like 5 minutes. That's the productivity gain. So that is, you can multiply that by the hourly rate and blah, 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 all that stuff, but it's just not as strong a reason as compound annual growth rate and margins. That's always probably going to be the leading factors.
Yep. That's what most business leaders are looking for.
Yeah, exactly.
So speaking of the business leaders and what they're looking at, and again, it goes back to, I know some of the work that you have been working on to come up with some of the strategy piece. And part of that is this 4-month sprint. And I believe you just mentioned it even a couple minutes ago. Can you explain a little bit about how you structure the 4-month sprint? And then in particular, I know that, in this 4-month sprint, you have, governance and assessments on the use cases, but that's wrapped into that 4-month quote unquote sprint. There's got to be some trade-offs or things that help you accelerate to keep that pace realistic. 4 months seems like a long time, but it's not. So curious on, number one, what's that sprint like? And then 2, how are you aligning the things you need to do to be able to meet within that 4-month sprint window?
Yeah, it's not a lot for a multi-billion-dollar company, which are most of my clients, right? That's not a lot of time. Yes, there's smaller companies, might take you 6 weeks, but really you do need like 3 or 4 months just to get organized. The first month is really, you're looking at, setting up all the workshops that you're going to need to talk to the business. What do they want? You're going to need to set up the vendors that you're going to select and the teams, the organizational model that you're going to operate under. So one of my clients they had a leadership council. So those were leaders in the business, in IT, that would make final decisions around the top priorities. And then you had an end user group council of actual practitioners. They're going to be the ones giving you the business cases. So in month 2, that's where you're capturing and documenting all the business cases, as well as you're starting to look at the current state architecture, data architecture, infrastructure, governance models that are available. In month 3, then you can start determining that whole feasibility versus value between those exercises you did in months 1 and 2, to figure out what are the resources you're going to need. How much is this going to cost, right? What are the people resources you're going to need, both internal and external? What are the processes that you're going to take on, and the technology that you're going to buy? And it's also a good time to also develop your responsible AI policies. That is something that the business should do, the client should do, because it's their business, right? They have a culture that will need to be embedded with this responsible AI. So it's really something that consulting doesn't do. It's really something the business has to do. And then in month 4, you develop something called a roadmap, which at a high level is what you would present, say, to executive steering committee. And it gives them the costs, the benefits, the projects, the definition, the timeline, the value, the feasibility, all those other elements that you've been gathering in the first 3 months. And then you also finalize the AI governance and data governance processes, because even though you got multi-billion-dollar companies out there, they don't have some of these things in place, believe it or not. They just don't. So that's what the 4 months looks like. It's a lot of work, and if you don't take the time to do it, you're just not going to be successful, in my opinion. You have to know where you're going directionally, if that makes sense.
No, it definitely does. You mentioned on something where I want to dig a little bit deeper. I think you did. You mentioned a AI council
Yeah.
and like a user group.
Hmm.
How are they different? Like what's their
Hmm.
need or use inside an organization, and and if they are indeed different, like what do they do differently in terms of like decision making, or how do they work in conjunction? Are they totally independent? How do you see that actually working?
So the AI council is usually executive leaders that own budgets, right? As well as they own like the groups. They're the leader of HR. They're the leader of supply chain. They're the leader of finance. They're the leaders, vice president and up usually, of these groups that are going to benefit from the AI transformation. They are needed to make final decisions about the budget, final decisions about the top priorities, right? Because they know where the pain is in their business, right? And they own that line of business. And so they have to be the kind of the final say in where the investment's going to go. Underneath them are the practitioners, the people in the groups, the HR analysts, the legal analysts, all the finance accountants, everybody that's works for them, who are actually going to feed their wants and needs and frustrations in particular that can be then automated and assisted with AI um, to make their business operate better, more efficiently. And so the two are definitely separate in terms of their meetings and things like that. But they come together like during the initial discovery workshops in the first month, where you're trying to get the information. What are the use cases from the practitioners in the room? What are the priorities from the leaders in the room? Right. And then when you boil down 250 to the top 25, you give each of them like three each group, then you still got to boil it down to the top three, right? That the company is willing to make an investment in, or they could invest in all three for all the groups. It depends how much money they have, right? But at the end of the day, the leadership is the only people that can really make decisions about the budget and the priority at the end of the day, the final priority.
That's a great leadway into my next question, actually, in terms of priority.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier, you had mentioned, looking at the 250 or so use cases for that one company, and got that brought down to whatever it was, three or four. That's obviously a long list to start with, and then getting to a short list. I'm assuming part of that was maybe loud voices within the organization say, this is the use case we want to go forward with. And, there's always politics,
Yeah.
certainly. But there's probably other things that were used to help score or help whittle down those
Mm-hmm.
various different use cases. I don't know if it was a magic formula. Did you use AI to help to derive what use cases do for AI? Or was there something more, fact-based, maybe something from a structure that you might have like a scoring rubric for, that you might be able to share if it was indeed
Sure.
something that was
Mm-hmm.
truly based upon a scoring mechanism?
Yeah, we used several dimensions, and then we looked at the dimensions for each of the use groups to see, did it add the highest value in terms of value drivers. So value drivers are things like operational excellence, risk mitigation, growth, right? Then there were trends. What is the industry doing? The industry that they're in. I was working with a manufacturer. So in the manufacturing industry, what are the trends that AI is being used for? Okay. And so you can align the business use cases. So I had a huge spreadsheet that had like the use case, the description, the value driver, the trend. And then there were themes internally within the business. So like the one I mentioned, customer insight to new product development. The other three were customer insight to enhanced experiences. So that's allowing the customer to interact with the data so that they can get information about the product or whatever. data and AI analytics optimization. So that's mostly for like internal reporting. There's always analytics that people need, but they want AI to give them reasoning or predictions, capabilities. And then the final one was automation of workflows that were scalable. So if you're building a chat, AI chat application for your customer, it's the same architecture that you could reuse for HR, for internal employees to look for their benefits and other information. It's the same architecture that you could use for, legal processes. So there's a lot of so it's those themes, right, that would help the business, but the themes are driven by those ROI, margins, investment, the top priorities, as I mentioned. So when you looked at a use case and all those things were lit up as a priority, and especially the last one, that there was an ROI to it, bingo, that's a priority.
Yep.
Right. Every field was kind of filled in so that you can see that there was, some kind of validation, some kind of due diligence taken with each of them. It's a bit of effort, but it's kind of revealing at the end. You're like, oh, sometimes some of them were ones that you automatically came to mind, right?
Yeah, and there's probably some that didn't come to mind that popped up based upon
Exactly.
going through that exercise.
Oh yeah, it was very valuable.
So one of the other things, and again, I know that we've talked, so I know some of the elements of the strategy, but I know one of them is what you classify as foundational pillars for AI capabilities. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more, and I'll just give a little bit of heads up for folks. It's something that, Michelle, I know you've talked about, it's focused around data, the infrastructure, governance, and talent. We talked a little bit about governance, but, can you explain a little bit more about those functional pillars? And then I have a question for you related to those functional pillars.
So in that spreadsheet, after I had the trends and value drivers and themes, I had columns for data, infrastructure, talent, and governance. And what that asked was, do we know what the data is for this use case? Do we have access to the data? So in many cases, like with social media impact, nobody's done that yet, really, and combine it with their customer data. That's pretty advanced. Then there's infrastructure. What do they use now? Are they on a cloud? Are they on premise? Are they want to move everything to the cloud? What kind of database architecture is the skill set in the team? Then there's governance. Like I mentioned, companies, I don't care how big they are, oftentimes they don't have formal AI governance, data governance, certainly, newer types of responsible AI frameworks. It doesn't exist. And then the talent is big because it's an opportunity to assess whether you have the talent or what database you're going to use. SQL, you're going to use Oracle. It depends on your talent, right? But then it becomes a career, right, for these people to move into these AI projects to advance their career, advance their knowledge about AI, and make them a much more valuable asset to the company. So in addition to the value drivers and all those things in the first few columns, those are called feasibility pillars. How feasible is it to bring us from a current architecture to the future architecture based on those four things? Do we know where the data is? Do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the governance policies? And do we have the talent? Oftentimes, you might have two of the four, you might have one of the four, or you might have three of the four, right? So the higher number of capabilities that you're closer to final state is going to have a higher score, right? But generally,
So I'll ask you a question on this. I have my own feeling, so I'm not going to tell you up front, but out of those four pillars that you just mentioned, whether it's data, infrastructure, governance, or talent, what have you seen that's consumed the most time to walk through? Like, what's been the most complicated, most difficult? And difficult could be for a whole different reasons, but what's taking the most time out of those four pillars?
I probably spend 60% of my project schedules on data prep, because the data scientists, will build the models. unfortunately, a lot of them spend too much time fixing the data,
Yeah.
right? That's a waste. So we need to have, better handle around what the data engineers are doing, DBAs are doing, with the incoming data. That is still about 60% of the project, to be honest, because you're also introducing new ways of, you're not looking at relational tables. We've talked about multimodal. That's real. When you're looking at social media data, there's going to be images of the competitors' products, or if you're looking at their websites, there's descriptions and images of the product. So you have to bring in all those, form factors into a data lake potentially that's going to be correlated in an algorithm together so that you can actually build a model.
Yep. And then
So,
and then you
and then
layering security on top of that. So
yeah,
you
and
and I,
APIs out of that to the
yeah,
application. I mean, there's a whole bunch of work
yeah. So you and I agreed. So data was going to be what I was going to say as well, but
for sure.
I didn't want to cloud your answer beforehand.
That
So
never changes.
that is so true. I
It's
mean,
always data.
yeah, we've been in this space for a number of years. Definitely, probably over 70 between the two of us,
I
and
know, right?
it's always data. It
It's
comes back
always the
to
same thing.
the
Mhm.
data itself.
Yes.
Um, so I'll jump ahead a little bit, Anya. So you go through, coming up with the use cases, put in this, structure, put a plan together, have these foundational pillars, and now you're, moving forward basically,
Yeah.
and you've identified some ROI. So once the program is actually live and running, you've got these use cases. Um, is there a particular KPI that business leaders sort of keen in on, or what are you like really showing them to convince them, especially the budget holders, that this AI quote unquote is not a fad, and it's not a cost center, but actually could be something that's a revenue generator? Like, is there something in particular they're looking at, or is it all of the above in terms of any KPI, or like the almighty, hey, is it generating revenue?
Mhm. It's really more complex than that, really, because they could be moving some other levers that you isn't even part of the project, right? It could be resourcing or internal restructuring, right? Like we've talked about, with that companies do all the time. Um, so there might be other factors that are, it's their hiring methods. Who knows, what's causing that. So the ROI is a target number and generally one that the CEO, CFO cares about, but tracking it and is going to be still a challenge because you don't know all the levers potentially that either had you achieve it or had you fail. But the one thing I know for sure is if you do not have a good organizational change management process, there won't be adoption. People are afraid. They don't really understand the concept of possibly co-pilots or assistants or agents. Yes, it makes them work more efficiently, but they're also still afraid that they're going to be replaced by it. And so adoption and making them understand how it's really going to benefit them and the company in the long term is huge. So one of the things that my last client did was in his executive leadership, he had the director of OCM in the group, the organizational change management,
I was
right?
about to say, what's OCM? So okay.
Oh, organizational change management. Because once you have these tools and it's going to change people's workflow, it's going to give them new applications, it's going to change the way they do their work. And so if you don't have a way to train people or to show them how it's changed their work, they're not going to adopt it because people have muscle memory and they have
Yeah,
to develop new
I think
muscle memory.
I think that's super important too. Like any organization that just puts a tool in front of a worker or user, it's bound to fail. They need to be trained. It's not
Yeah,
only like training on the tool, but it's the context around that. Like, how are
right,
they supposed to use that in their existing business processes? So
right.
like I've seen this plenty of times where
Mhm.
like,
Yeah,
oh, here's Copilot, here's how you put in a prompt. Great, but that has no meaning. It's like,
yeah.
how am I supposed to use this in my 9 to 5 or whatever your working hours are? Because without that context, you have no real like insight on how to best use those tools for what your work is
Mhm.
today, as well as what your work could be, next year. So
Yeah, writing a good prompt is really important,
yeah,
to give you the right answer.
Yeah. Shadab and I, it was actually our last episode. We talked about context in engineering. So it's not even prompt
Mhm.
engineering anymore. It's really about how do we as humans,
Right.
best utilize these tools, and what really sets us apart, or what could set you apart from somebody else that's looking to either get your job or take the next job, is how do you best leverage these AI tools? And it's all around your context, your learning, and the things that that can provide additional insight
Yeah.
into these AI tools and structures.
Yeah.
So
Domain expertise is so important.
exactly, yeah, you call
Yeah,
it like context domain expertise sprinkled in with these AI tools.
for sure. And like, not to mention like the dev engineering part, there's still so much education that has to happen at the database engineer level or the AI software engineer level. It's not enough of them,
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah,
It just, you have to, yeah, hire those out initially and then they can teach you to fish. But at the end of the day, da- database engineers, I've worked with them all my life, love them, but they're not data scientists. And that's a whole different, level of education and learning that is going on right now so that people know what to do with the
mhm.
data to prepare it for AI. It's different.
Yeah, it's very different,
Very
and
different. Yeah.
they need to learn and know it.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we did talk about very quickly up front was, security is certainly super important to, any of these use cases that might make its way through the funnel, and, coming up with a strategy, obviously for a company, um, security is super important. But that there's a bigger umbrella there, and it's really around responsible AI.
Yes.
And I know one of the things that we talked about previously was a responsible AI framework, or at least whether or not you want to call it a framework or just things to kind of quote unquote consider. But you had mentioned there,
Mhm.
considerations around what is responsible AI. How should an organization actually look at it? Love for you to kind of walk through like what are the top things that should be considered, must be considered around responsible AI for an organization. But more importantly, I'd be curious on this: is there one element or one policy, if you will, around the framework that you've seen or helped implement that would potentially be a challenge for an organization? It could be something that's controversial, like, oh, no, we've got that covered.
Mhm.
In reality, it's not. Or just the enforcement of those things, or maybe even like an organizational change that might be uncomfortable
Mhm.
for any large org.
Yeah, so yeah, there's a whole lot of documentation available on responsible AI, but generally it covers things like privacy of data, integrity of data, security of data. In addition, some of the newer elements that AI brings to bear: hallucinations, misinformation, and bias. I would have to say bias is probably the hardest thing to put your finger on because just by virtue of the word, it's an opinion,
Right.
right? Bias, right? And so capturing that in a policy is difficult. And it really could be driven largely by the culture of the company and what they believe and how they want things to work. Um, and it really, Satya had a really great article recently about human in the loop. No matter what the AI tells you, you have to have the human in the loop to make sure that that bias, misinformation, or hallucination does not occur. Somebody still has to, tell, just like kind of like data labeling, right? Human has to look at it to say, yes,
Yeah.
that's good or
Yeah.
that's bad, right?
Yeah. That's a cat.
So yeah, the whole human in the loop is a huge topic in terms of creating the responsible AI so that it's can be policies just like security policies. And it just has to be rules that people have to learn how to use. But the beautiful thing now is in the creation of AI applications, if you have the rules written somewhere, the AI can take those rules and make sure, they're considered. Just like when we worked on tax and audit together, right? There's rules, regulations. I mean, it's written down. Apply it to the data, and then the AI is really good at that.
So here's somewhat of a related question. So we talk about responsible AI, security controls. There's probably governance sprinkled into that as well.
For
But
sure.
then you have the other side of this, which is hey, we want to go super fast to prove out ROI for this
Mhm.
AI system, right? So to me, you almost have these like two competing mindsets. Like one,
Mhm.
I really
Yeah.
want to make sure I have tight controls, and
Yeah.
then two, like let's go super fast because we want to prove this out. And I think about this especially as it relates to the security of things. Let me put it this way. I've seen this plenty of times already where organizations think their data is secured. They've got it pretty much locked down on relational source systems, but the semi-structured or unstructured data,
Yeah.
not so much.
Not
And
so
there's
much.
a lot of personal identifiable information kind of stored in those things, which kind of creeps up when you start doing like any type of rag patterns over that data. So here's my question for you, and this is where I was going, like what you've seen as far as these responsible AI patterns and practices. But when you're really trying to go rapid to do these rapid experimentations against these use cases, how do you balance out like basically how can we go fast while at the same
Mhm.
time having
Yeah.
some controls that you don't let data slip
Yeah.
that you have? Where does
Yeah.
it
I
matter?
have it built in to my schedules. 2 solid months of UAT and organizational change management processes and learning um, before you go live. And so the other way of kind of making it go faster is,
So you're
you know,
saying testing is still important.
I think that nobody talks about it enough. I don't see a lot of articles about quality control. Yet
Yeah.
here we are,
Yeah.
Google takes Gemini down the day that it releases it. I mean, nobody's looking at it,
Yeah.
right? And so that I build that into the schedule. The other way to accelerate too is, I kind of have upfront like 4 to 8 weeks of the infrastructure, and that's usually like the internal IT group standing up the cloud and adding all the Azure services or whatever they're going to buy, right? So if it's a Microsoft implementation, and then you go into like the data scientist activities, DBA activities, AI software, engineering activities, followed by that whole quality control that, I don't really see a lot of people talking about. And I'm afraid that they're not putting into the schedule, but as, a core PMP, I always think about the things that you need to do. But once you've built that first 6 to 8 weeks of the infrastructure, then you're just turning stuff on, you know, like for the next use case and the next use case and the next use case. And so oftentimes, like I said, if you're doing like chats, you probably turned it on for the customer service, center. You can reuse that architecture, for your internal customer service activities like HR, for example.
Mhm.
And then it's just a matter of adding data or potentially other architectures like streaming data, like if you're doing social media or if you want to implement a RAG model. But at the end of the day, that's how you kind of shortcut it. You have to make that investment up front, but then the use cases can come quickly, after that, and so they can see results quickly. Because I usually have like my data scientist. So if I have a data scientist, right, once they're done building the models for the first use case, they can just go right into the next one, right? There doesn't have to be any delay in waiting for the second project to start. You can just continuously have them working, and that should reduce the time frame overall.
No, that makes sense. So one of the other questions you talk about reducing, time frames.
Yeah.
One aspect is obviously the technology, what you do, data governance things. You talked
Yeah,
about the AI councils, but people are an important part of this as well.
for sure.
And there's this notion of you're going to have some forward-facing people that really know AI-based tools, right?
Hmm.
Whether it's ChatGPT, Copilot,
Maybe.
Gemini, whatever. But there's going to be, I would say, a large portion of an organization, maybe as high as like 70%, depending upon who that org is, that may not have any experience
No,
or any
yeah,
exposure.
usually not.
So, how do you, what are you thinking about in terms of upskilling those? Or is
Hmm.
it more of a fact of like in this strategy, are companies looking at just like we need to hire a whole new set of people? Like what are these things that you think about and or put in these AI strategies as it relates to the upskilling of existing talent, acquiring new talent, or is it, hey, we need to go and grab new people from external companies? And by the way, part of this is there's twofold. One is the development, and I'm speaking, what I'm about to say is based upon experiences. A lot of the organizations I've been working with, they're not necessarily up to speed on all the things they need to do for
No.
developing
Right.
in the AI world, which is fine. You train them as well. But the other side of this are like the people in the business, and that's really what I'm talking about, because these are the people that are going to use these tools day in, day out. What do you need to do to train them? Or is it, again, going back to you're looking for new types of people to bring into the business to be able to do that?
I think, so for development, let me answer that one first. I often bring a consulting team on board because they won't have, usually, even like a multi-billion-dollar company, they probably don't have a data scientist or an AI software engineer yet. Probably not. Those are very specialized skills right now and hard to find, hard to hire for. And then you have people on the team like DBAs and data engineers that are probably already busy 100% of the time. And so you need a consulting organization to come in and backfill kind of those roles that are roles on the team, but they just don't have time to be on the project.
Mm-hmm.
Project manager, I always have to, recommend. And then business analyst, somebody who can help kind of, keep the business user acceptance going and keep the business engaged to make sure you have that alignment between the business use case and the technology. So that's development. In terms of people, I think you have to look for, there are going to be people that are going to be really interested in understanding the AI. And you need to engage the people that have like really deep domain knowledge, because without that, what you build is going to be useless, or people aren't going to adopt it because it really doesn't fit the culture or the workflows that they're used to or anything like that. But you still need to teach them, mandate probably some kind of training, 40, 80 hours a year learning this stuff, because if they don't, they really won't have a career anywhere, to be honest. I mean, that's just reality. That's just happens to be the fact. So, but I think there's that a lot of people want to learn. They realize that, for the sake of their job and their career, they need to learn this stuff. But like I keep mentioning, the organizational change management leader is going to be critical in developing that curriculum and that training and that, the messaging communications around, the new technology and in particular the workflow changes that would occur in their own business group. So, yeah. But then eventually they might have to hire a data scientist. But initially, companies are probably going to want to just invest in the project, right? Just to get it going and just to have the infrastructures created in the, your data science workbench, as a service from Azure. You know what I mean? Like setting up those things so that later on, they could hire people full time, and I'm sure they often do from the consulting organizations. But initially, they're not going to be. It's going to be hard to hire, versus you just bringing a consulting team on board from partners or whatever, that have that type of resource.
So let me two closing questions here.
Sure.
One is, so you've certainly have worked with organizations, helped to put together the strategy. You talked about, paring down use cases, doing prototypes on them. What would be the thing that you would say to get an organization out of what I call, this proverbial stuck in like prototyping mode? Like, what would take them to go into like a production mindset? Like, so what's going to be the thing that like actually gets them there?
Mm-hmm. The priority is really important, like new product development. Once it can be used to actually create new products in the manufacturing process or in the design process, it's exciting, right? To see that actually happening. And so that's why the proof of concepts are really important and the priorities are really important, because people have to see it to believe it. It's just the truth. And so once they start seeing it working, in helping a product manager develop a product, or the R&D team, to develop the manufacturing process or whatever is needed, once they actually see it being implemented in these pilots, practitioners just go crazy and they just come up with these amazing ideas and things that you never even thought of in the beginning, right? They'll use the tools in ways that we can't even imagine, just like when you think about Excel, in the day when it first came out, or the things that people did with it is like, that's why it's the biggest database in the world, right? But anyway, I think it's you just have to give the people at it and let them figure it out. But they will come up with things that are amazing.
So my last question will be more of a future-looking viewpoint from you. So there's obviously a lot of things that AI can do, and you even mentioned some of the things today, like these tools need to be multimodal. There's obviously a lot that's coming into play around agents. How can companies thinking about maybe fine-tuning their models, especially even now it's been a lot easier to do fine-tuning. What do you believe would be like a major force factor as far as a new quote unquote emerging AI capability that will have the most impact over the next 12 months, which in AI terms is long. But what do you think will be the biggest impact? Again, I know I have my thoughts, which I'll hold off for another second, but
it's definitely agentics. I got the privilege of being an AI PC PM for an alliance between Lenovo, Qualcomm, and Microsoft. And, it's amazing, what they've done with the new Snapdragon neural processing unit, which is going to sit on the motherboard next to the CPU and GPU, but it's designed specifically for AI algorithm workloads, in combination with the Windows 11 Copilot Studio that has 110 vendors that have built agents, that are specific. Edge computing is going to be huge this year. There's going to be hundreds of millions of AI PCs coming to replace aging laptops and whatnot. And it's time. I mean, in order to get that adoption, you need these machines, because the agents themselves are going to help the practitioner. Let's be honest, right? You're not going to spend your whole day in a large language model or a RAG model. The people that are actually doing the work on the ground, it has to happen at their desktop, at their mobile device, edge computing is going to be much bigger this year, right? Than some of it's definitely has to happen, because that's where the practitioner works, right? And some of the, things that I've seen, like the new Windows 11 Copilot, fantastic. One of the big wow demos that I would do was, it was a Teams meeting between one person in the US and another person in China. And the person in China was speaking Mandarin Chinese, and the person in the US was speaking English. And it uses something called captions, live captions. And it was translating what she was saying for Mandarin Chinese. Underneath her face was a caption that translated to English. And when he responded to that, what he read, it translated it to Mandarin Chinese for her. That's real life in a global, multinational. So there were some features in the Windows 11 Copilot that are just like so practical. They have it increased the efficiency of the neural processing unit and the whole AI PC, increased the battery life to 24 hours. Think how effective that is for people that are like on an airplane. How many times has your laptop died, or if you're in marketing or you're presenting or something, or, that got huge cheers from customers.
Yep.
And,
I was to say, certainly the hardware aspect is
amazing.
Is doubling down. It's advancing at great rates, and things like you said, the NPUs and what that could do, changing the game. But even so, I think even bigger, and you mentioned as well, is the agentic side. So as companies reevaluate what they're doing with AI, and I wouldn't even say reevaluate, because many companies haven't done anything yet, but it's they're moving past just building these chatbots and
Yeah.
applications that do those types of things and really starting to get into what does it mean for my business? How can I take and
Yeah.
automate,
Mhm.
I'll call it this way, the promise of what RPA was supposed to do, robotic process
Right.
automation,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
taking that and actually building agents where you don't
Mhm.
actually have to code all of
No.
those things. That's really changing, in my
Yeah.
opinion,
It is.
what organizations are thinking about, and the next 12 months are going to be even bigger than probably what we've seen in the last 3 years with the change or amount of change with what these large language models have brought to the
Yeah.
table.
The
So
multi agents. Yeah, for sure.
yep,
No, so I see edge computing as being a big, talking point this year
yep, cool.
because people aren't going to be working in the quantum computer. Let's just face the facts. They don't know what that is and they don't care, but they are going to care about what's in front of them every day.
Sure. Yeah,
You know,
eventually everyone will understand what.
yeah, eventually, but they're
Yeah,
not going to. They're so far removed from it at the end of the day.
yep,
They probably, just like most of my customers, they don't really care what the technology does
yeah,
as long as it works.
yeah, exactly. Which comes back to the almighty KPI ROI and
That's
having
right.
that.
Exactly. Yep.
So wanted to thank you again
Oh,
for
you're
joining
welcome.
us today. It was great walking through like how companies could, potentially think about orchestrating a AI strategy. What are the things that, they should consider? You certainly walk through a lot of things that you've seen working with customers, and it's a great way to kind of balance out,
Yeah.
reality from, like you said, from hype. So
Yeah, for sure.
um,
Well, thanks
great.
for having me again. I
Likewise.
appreciate it. See you at
Thanks
the
for,
next one.
yeah.
Bye
See you again.
bye.
Thanks, Michelle.